Project managers spend most of their time communicating, and for good reason. A successful project depends on good communication, and problems are almost always blamed on bad communication. Today's projects can move fast, and many different groups will clamor for information. It's easy to get overwhelmed by all the email and voicemail. This course will help you streamline your communication into a steady flow. Then I'll show you how to create a communication plan so that everyone in your project knows what to expect. I'll also show you how to create clear, well-written reports that are more likely to be read. And finally, we'll talk about avoiding some common communication challenges. So let's start talking about project communication. All the world's a stage, and each project manager plays many parts. But in order to play your part, you need to make sure you know your audience. You might not think of your project as having an audience, but it does. They're probably not laughing, cheering, and clapping, but your audience is listening and they're interested. The way you communicate should depend on your audience. If you think about it, that's true for most of your communication. You might share with a good friend that you really like wool sweaters, but you probably wouldn't tell your supervisor. You might tell your doctor about the pain in your neck, but you wouldn't usually tell a person on the train. It's the same with your projects. Once you understand your project's audience, you can start categorizing who gets what information. In general, there are 3 different groups of people that you'll want to consider for your audience. They're the stakeholders, supporters, and spectators. The first group are the stakeholders. These are the people who have a stake in your project. These could include project managers, upper management, team members, vendors, and customers. These people have something riding on the project. They could even be your competitors. The next group are your supporters. These are the people who will help you finish your project. They help you with your work without actually working on the project. These could include finance, IT support, facilities, lawyers, and quality assurance. They're the background chorus for your project. They can help you succeed, but they won't be held to blame if the project fails. The final group is the spectators. These are the people who aren't stakeholders or supporters. They may be interested in your work, but the project doesn't directly impact them. This may include project managers from other departments. The spectators won't be interested in your day-to-day operations. You won't want to email the finance department every time your meeting has a room change. Instead, you'll just want a simple way to update them on your project's status. So your plan needs to address each group and their needs, then show how to communicate to these groups and what information to share. So to do this, you'll want to create an audience list. This list should have 3 groups: stakeholders, supporters, and spectators. Then you should add roles to each group. Be sure to add roles and not actual people. A lot of times, people will be promoted or moved to different roles. So it's better to understand the communication based on the role and not the individual. The audience list should be very specific on how to communicate with each group. You should specify one-to-one or group meetings, email lists, and reports. Don't just say something generic like email, phone, or meeting. It should also show each group's communication needs. How much information does each group need to know? Project communication can get complex quickly, so when you create your list, keep it clear and simple. You don't want to spend your time trying to communicate the wrong information to the wrong people. A typical project starts out with a flurry of communication. The project manager talks with the directors, the stakeholders talk with project managers, and then they talk with the teams. After this flurry, the work begins. So you can think of your communication almost like a submarine. Most of the communication happens within the team and away from your stakeholders. Then your project comes up to communicate and everyone gets updated. Then it resubmerges. A few weeks later, the project will surface and everyone gets an update. And then the team will resubmerge. Your stakeholders will tell you how many times they want an update. Some stakeholders don't want to hear from you until the work is finished. Other stakeholders like to be pinged every day. It's very important to know your stakeholders' expectations before you submerge to focus on your work. That's why you'll want a project communication plan. How much does your stakeholder need to know about your project? Who is the audience, and what do they need to know, and why? If your stakeholder requires a lot of communication, then be sure to spend some time creating a very detailed communication plan. There are two different styles of project communication plans. There's the stakeholder communication plan and the event communication plan. The stakeholder communication plan focuses on the who. It will be your audience list and then a plan for how to communicate. The event communication plan focuses mostly on the how. It will be a list of meetings, reports, and email blasts. Then it describes how each of them help you communicate. Sometimes your organization will prefer one plan over the other. How you design your plan will depend on your stakeholders. If you can choose either, then you'll want to create a stakeholder communication plan. These plans are easier to organize and are clearer to follow. Event communication plans are focused on meetings, reports, and activities, so they can be difficult to spell out ahead of time. Try to imagine planning your key communication meetings, reports, and presentations before the project starts. The stakeholder communication plan is less likely to change. You'll likely have the same audience list throughout your entire project. To start your stakeholder plan, first find out if you already have a stakeholder register. The stakeholder register is a list of everyone who has a stake in the project, so that you can get yourself a head start. If you don't have a stakeholder register, then just try to create a list of stakeholders. The stakeholder communication plan should address 4 items. These are: which stakeholder is going to receive the communication? How are they going to receive it? What is the communication going to say? And when are they going to get it? I once worked with a school superintendent who only wanted to receive updates through text messages. She would never read email, and all phone calls went straight to voicemail. The which stakeholder was the school superintendent. The how was a text message. The what was short project updates. And the when was Friday after 4 p.m. You should use this feedback to add to your stakeholder communication plan. Also, be sure to keep it updated throughout your project. There's an old joke that goes like this. A man named Oscar was driving down a country road. When he went around the corner, he saw a man driving towards him in a red convertible. The man was talking on the phone and zigzagging in and out of his lane. He turned the corner and swerved into his lane. As he passed Oscar, the man yelled, "Pig!" Oscar turned around and yelled, "Learn to drive!" But when he turned around, Oscar ran straight into the pig. At a very basic level, communication is the process of encoding meaning into messages and decoding messages back into meaning. You can use spoken words, writing, pictures, and gestures. But there's a lot of opportunity for meaning to get lost along the way. So let's go back to our pig. When the man rounded the corner, he yelled out, "Pig!" We can assume his meaning was, "There's a pig in the road, watch out." But he didn't have much time, so pig is how it came out. But the word pig in English-speaking countries can have a lot of different meanings. It could mean the animal, but it's also an insult. Think about how Oscar decoded the message. What meaning did he take from pig? Why was he yelling? What was he doing? Does the word have more than one meaning? As a project manager, all of the messages you send and receive have at least some noise. You just need to make sure that the messages aren't drowned out by the noise. When the noise is louder than the message, then you're in real danger of miscommunicating. You could tell if there's a lot of risk for noise by looking at the message content, circumstances, and context. Sometimes the content will have a lot of noise. The content are usually the words. It can also be commonly used gestures like thumbs up or thumbs down. Sometimes the content already has noise built in. Here the word pig has more than one meaning. Also, the circumstances will add noise to the message. The circumstances are what you're doing when you receive the message. Let's say at the end of a 2-hour meeting, someone says, "Well, that was a great use of our time." The circumstances suggest that this is sarcasm. If someone said the same thing at the end of a 30-minute seminar, you might accept the message as genuine. Finally, the context will add a lot of noise. The context is where you are when you receive the message. Say you're in a business meeting and a stranger in a suit says, "You did a great job." You'd probably react differently than if a stranger says it at a grocery store. The context will give you a lot of background information about what the other person is trying to communicate. The same message in a different context will mean different things. Our pig could have survived if the content, circumstances, or context had had a little bit less noise. Maybe if the content was, "Watch out for the pig," or if the person drove a tractor instead of a red convertible, then you'd have a different context. Watch for these when you try to determine how much noise you're getting with your messages. Always assume that the communication has a little noise. Then you'll have a better chance of understanding the meaning. A few years ago, pirates captured an Italian cargo ship called the Monte Cristo. The crew was shuffled to the bottom of the ship. When the pirates weren't looking, they wrote the ship's location in a bottle and tossed it overboard. The NATO ships retrieved the bottle. They read the note and knew that the crew was safe. The pirates gave up and no one was hurt. One-way communication saved the day. Your project won't have pirates, but you'll certainly run into one-way communication. In fact, almost all of your communication will be one-way. One-way communication is a type of asynchronous communication. You're sending a message to someone, but they won't read and respond instantly. It's often pushed or pulled from someone else. A good example of one-way communication is email. It's a message that's pushed from someone into your inbox. It's often used as an announcement. Project managers are working in the golden age of one-way communication. Think of all the email, reports, and memos you receive every day. It might seem like you spend all of your time reading one-way communication. But many project managers forget the disadvantages to one-way communication. You should think of email as not that much different from throwing a bottle into the sea. This type of communication lacks facial expressions and the speaker's tone of voice. There's no real-time interaction. That makes one-way communication pretty limited. So be sure to think of one-way communication as notice. You're notifying people that something happened. Email is perfect for a notification like functional review board meeting canceled. It would be risky to write an email with the subject, your job performance. The difference is the content of the message. The first message is straightforward, a true notification. It's unlikely to be misinterpreted. The other is about a topic that could be sensitive and will likely need some clarification. You should only use one-way communication for low emotion messages. Think about the last time you read an email and it seemed sad or angry, then you later talked to the person and they said they were just fine. Behavior scientists tell us that we think we understand emotions in text, but in reality, most of us depend on tone and facial expressions to help us interpret meaning. More often, we're adding emotion to other people's messages without even realizing it. We're also not very good at writing emotion. Most of the emotion we want to communicate is lost in email, reports, and memos. If you sense that there's some emotional noise, it's often misunderstood. As a project manager, you should always follow up any questions from a one-way message with a two-way conversation. If there's a question, it usually means that your message wasn't really a notification and is likely to be misunderstood. If you want to send a one-way message, be sure to understand what works best. If your message is sensitive, then use two-way communication. For a simple notice, then just use an email message or report. At the end of the 19th century, the telephone was invented and it changed the world. Previously, you had to transmit beeps that would be converted into written letters. The new telephone was a marvel of two-way communication. Two-way communication is one of the most powerful tools you have as a project manager. You can think of it as two-way real-time communication, like a face-to-face chat, a phone call, or even through instant messaging. As you're sending a message, the other person is receiving it in real time. You need to nurture two-way communication. It should be your go-to method for all important communication. If you understand the power of two-way communication, you'll start to depend on it in your projects. It's about having a conversation. An important part of two-way communication is this back and forth between sender and receiver. There should be a rhythm. A message goes out, and the person has an opportunity to respond. The best form of two-way communication is a face-to-face conversation. With a face-to-face conversation, you can take advantage of visual cues, gestures, and body language. I once worked for an organization that discouraged two-way communication. Coworkers were spread throughout the building. Very few of the cubicles had names on them. The meeting rooms were booked months in advance. So this organization had trouble completing their projects. The projects were swamped with email messages and replies. Everyone spent a lot of time trying to find answers to basic questions. One-way communication takes a lot less effort and a lot less time, so it's much more widely used. But one-way communication should be limited to notifications. For explaining, answering questions, and for high emotion messages, you'll want to use two-way communication. So you should think of two-way communication as an investment in your project. You'll spend more time communicating and less time clearing up miscommunications. You'll get the most value from two-way communication if you follow some simple practices. You should focus on listening and making sure that you don't multitask while chatting. You can enhance your two-way communication by being aware of physical obstacles. If you have an office, don't keep a chair on the other side of your desk. Instead, place two chairs on the opposite corner of your office. You might not realize that your desk is a communication barrier between you and your audience. A physical barrier can quickly become an emotional barrier. Instead, just get up from your desk and sit right down next to the person. Also, be sure to make the distinction between what you want to hear and what you're actually hearing. Everyone's tendency is to accept good news and be more skeptical of bad news. So follow up with questions if you get good news. If you use two-way communication and you use it well, you'll find that it solves many of your communication challenges. If you take the time, you'll gain a newfound respect for this oldest form of communication. Think about the last time you heard a sales announcement in a store. After about 5 minutes, the words blend together. If you're listening for an hour, then it starts to sound like background noise. There's some danger that this can also happen with your project. The more messages you send, the more it starts to sound like background noise. As project managers, there's a lot of ways to deliver your message, but delivery is only half of communication. To communicate, you'll also need to actively listen. Active listening has a few components: rinsing, remixing, and rewording. Rinsing the message means deciding which parts are relevant and which are irrelevant. It's tricky to rinse your messages of extra content. It means that you'll have to remove everything that's irrelevant. It also means removing items that are technical and can hide the real problem. This extra content might be funny or interesting, but it's usually irrelevant. The second part of the process is remixing and rewording. That's when you're synthesizing what the person said and paraphrasing back to them what you heard. I once worked on a data migration project. One of the engineers pulled me aside and said that he was the only person who knows the structure of the old database. Then he pointed out that the new engineers didn't understand the old system. Finally, he said that he couldn't help with the migration over the weekend because he was coaching his son's baseball team. As a project manager, you have to rinse away all the outside information and focus on the reason the person's talking. With the engineer, it's basically a rescheduling request. This takes a lot of discipline. People will bring up items that are annoying, like, "What do you mean the engineers I hired are inexperienced?" Don't get pulled into different topics when you're listening. Stay focused on the reason the other person is talking. After you rinse the information, you should remix it so it makes sense to both you and the listener. You might have noticed that the engineer didn't actually ask to reschedule the test migration. He just presented you with a problem. He said he couldn't do the test migration because he's coaching. So don't just assume he wants to wait. Figure out directly what he wants. So now you should remix what the engineer is saying. So you could reply, "Are you asking me to postpone the test migration to another weekend?" Then wait for his response. The remix part of active listening is where you clear up and add information to what the other person is saying. After each remix, you're clearing up assumptions and clarifying the question. The final part of active listening is to repeat the rinsed and remixed information. So you might want to say something like, "Are you asking me to postpone the test migration to later that weekend?" If the person adds more information, then make sure you still rinse it away and remix it and repeat. With active listening, at least you'll have an accurate understanding. Then you'll be in a better position to respond. In your career, you'll see that if you're wearing a suit and tie, people are more likely to listen to you. Consultants know this, project managers know this, and politicians know this. Formality matters. It's the same way with how we communicate. When we communicate, we can do it either formally or informally. A formal message should communicate professionalism. It's communication dressed up in a suit and tie. So a formal message might be a standard office memo. It also might be a slide presentation. Some message channels are more formal than others. Formal communication comes with its own set of assumptions. When someone reads an office memo or sits in a presentation, they'll have a different set of assumptions. These assumptions show the listener how to respond. If an executive receives an office memo that the project's over budget, it will have a different effect than if they say it when you bump into them in the elevator. Formal communication is appropriate depending on the intended receiver and the content of the message. So you should really think about formal communication in two parts. There's a people part and a message part. If you're deciding whether to use formal communication, you should think about both of these parts. You'll want to use formal communication if your supervisor asks for an update, but you might just choose to send off an email with the same message if it's someone outside of your organization. So you would change the medium to be formal based on the person who requested the message. In general, messages that are consequential should always be sent using formal communication. Formal communication can be delivered in two ways. There's formal written communication and formal verbal communication. Some communication should always be delivered using formal written communication. If you're negotiating a contract, you'd usually use formal written communication, but check with your manager for the company standards. Formal verbal communication is usually a presentation or demonstration. This helps show that you care about what you're communicating and that it's important to the organization. Say you wanted to give a status update on a project. If you give an update to the project stakeholders, you'd certainly want to use formal verbal communication. So in this case, you'd probably want to do a slide presentation and answer follow-up questions. You'd also want to dress formally to communicate professionalism. If the audience were different, you might want to change the way you communicate. Let's say that you hired a new developer. In that case, you'd be fine with informal communication. You just take them out to lunch and update them on the project status. So even though the message was the same, you change the delivery based on the person. If the project went over budget, you'd likely want to use formal written communication. Just remember that formal communication signals a higher level of professionalism and seriousness that you'd need for certain messages. Most of the energy in project communication is about formal communication. You can find plenty of courses on improving your business writing or presentation skills. But the majority of your communication will be informal. Informal communication is delivered in two ways. There's informal written communication and informal verbal communication. A good way to think about informal communication is all of your communication that's not prepared. In today's projects, you'll mostly receive informal messages as email. It's informal because it arrives in a non-standard format and it's casually written. A classic informal message is notice, something like there's cake in the kitchen or the 10 a.m. meeting is canceled. A project manager will often receive dozens or hundreds of these messages each day. It's almost as if someone is tapping you on your shoulder. This short, informal, written communication is how you'll usually interact with your team. But you'll also have a lot of informal verbal communication. Although it's not as popular as email, these chats will still take up a good chunk of your day. They're usually cubicle discussions or feedback after formal meetings. Like formal communication, these informal chats come with several assumptions. The fact that it's informal usually means that it's easier to ask questions. You're not as worried about interrupting. This is the real strength of informal communication. It's usually much easier to get the unfiltered information that you need. Sometimes the presenter will say something that's incorrect at a formal presentation, but it can be rude to correct the presenter during a formal presentation. So most of that will be clarified with a small chat after the formal event. When I was a project manager, the program manager would have a slide presentation each month on how each project fit into the larger portfolio. The meeting was a formal, verbal presentation. The program manager would prepare remarks and then deliver them to the group. Because it was a large audience, you could never ask any questions. Instead, each project manager would add several small, informal chats to clarify parts of the presentation. Some project managers do this by sitting close to their team. Then they can easily see when someone's available for a quick chat. Other project managers will do something called MBWA. That's an acronym for Management by Walking Around. These project managers walk around and encourage team members to have spontaneous chats. Project managers know that having a lot of these chats will fill in some of the gaps from informal reports and presentations. Another thing project managers can do is make sure that you're accessible for chats with your stakeholders. They'll usually tell you more informally than they would share in a formal report. Finally, make sure that you're seen as friendly and interested in solving problems. This is a common theme throughout all communication challenges. If your team or your stakeholders see you as unfriendly, then they'll be less likely to have these quick chats. You won't be able to get by with just formal communication. If you skip these chats and depend only on formal reports, then you'll always be partly in the dark. When you're a project manager, you'll have a lot of people who are interested in your work. People will be interested in how the project affects them. They'll also be interested in some of the decisions you make. Some of these people will be your stakeholders. A stakeholder is someone who believes that the project has an effect on them. This belief could be real or imagined. Your communication plan will have a list of stakeholders in a stakeholder register. It's simply a list of everyone who has a stake in your project. For larger projects, you'll have a stakeholder management plan. This is a detailed look at how to work with the stakeholders in your project. It builds on your stakeholder register. The first step in your stakeholder management plan is to categorize your stakeholders. When you categorize your stakeholders, you don't categorize them as individuals. Instead, you'll need to categorize them as roles. I once worked on a large healthcare project. There were doctors, insurance companies, patients, and administrators. To categorize them, I needed to identify their roles. So I didn't put names like Dr. Johnson in my stakeholder register or list out a company like ABC Insurance. Instead, I just created roles like lead doctor and insurance partner. These roles simplify the stakeholder register. All doctors and insurance companies should have similar communication needs. Remember that with your communication plan, you're trying to streamline your communication. So if you put in individual names in your register, then you'll need to know the person to understand their needs. You'll want to lump together as much communication as you can into one group. That way you won't send a lot of updates to people with different criteria. So once you have your roles in your register, you should categorize them based on their communication needs. For that, you should use the P3I technique. You want to list out their power, impact, interest, and influence. Power is pretty much what it sounds like. It's the ability that this role has in the organization to influence others and decisions. So you might see that executive management roles usually have a lot of power. Impact is different from power. In many projects, you won't have access to executive management. Instead, you'll be working with someone who updates the executives, like an executive assistant. This person might not have that much power, but they'll provide the resources for the people that do. Stakeholders will also have different levels of interest in your project. So you want to categorize your stakeholders by their interest level. A stakeholder might have power but very little interest. The head of human resources might be very powerful, but they probably won't be thinking much about your project. Finally, there are your stakeholders who have influence on your project. These are the stakeholders that you'll work most closely with. Each of your stakeholders should be categorized using this P3I technique. It will make your register much more useful and is a key part of your stakeholder management plan. As a project manager, you'll never hear anyone say, "Take your time." Instead, you'll probably get a lot of "as soon as possible" or ASAPs. So how do you communicate with everyone ASAP all the time? The short answer is you don't. Instead, you'll need to prioritize your communication with a power and interest grid. This grid is for you and not for your stakeholders, so don't share it. It shows who gets the highest priority when communicating. The power and interest grid has 4 quadrants. Starting at the top left hand and moving clockwise, there are the high power, low interest stakeholders and high power and high interest stakeholders. These are the top stakeholders you'll need to prioritize. The bottom right quadrant has the high interest, low power stakeholders. These are usually stakeholders outside of your project. They might be bloggers or people in the media. They're powerful in other areas, but not a high priority for your project. The bottom left quadrant has low power, low interest stakeholders. These are the stakeholders that are barely connected to the project. they should have the lowest priority in your communication plan. Low power, low interest stakeholders are usually barely connected to your project. They might be the end users that are only interested in your project if the website is down. So take the time to decide which stakeholders go into which quadrant. Now that you have your stakeholders in your power and interest grid, you can use it to build out your stakeholder register. The stakeholder register is a ranked list of all of your stakeholders. There should be a column in your register called Priority. This is where you'll create your communication priority label. So take each quadrant in your power and interest grid and write your communication goal for each of these 4 quadrants. This goal becomes our label. The top left quadrant has your high power, low interest stakeholders. You want to keep these stakeholders satisfied. So this usually means that you want to send them just enough communication to keep them in the loop. So in your stakeholder register plan, you'll label them Keep Satisfied. In the top right quadrant, you'll have your high power and high interest stakeholders. You'll want to manage their communication closely. This is usually quite a bit more than just keeping them in the loop. You want to make sure that they have copies of all your reports and access to all the project information. I might use Manage Closely for my label. The bottom right quadrant is the low power, high interest stakeholders. The stakeholders should be just informed about your project. This usually involves a lot of one-way communication. Inform is a good label for these stakeholders. Finally, you'll have the bottom left quadrant. These are the low power, low interest stakeholders. They'll be the lowest priority stakeholders. You'll need to monitor them to make sure they don't become higher priority stakeholders. So we could label them Monitor. So now that you have your 4 labels to prioritize your stakeholders, you can then update the register with these labels. I've done it with the most commonly used labels, but you can use whatever you want. Just make sure that the label is meaningful. These labels should be laid out in your communication management plan. This will then become part of your larger project management plan. I once worked on a project where the executive sponsor would come down and talk with everyone on the team. When she asked how things were going, the developers would respond with a long list of challenges. Then the executive asked why the developers seemed so bogged down. There was a language mismatch between the executive and the developers. The developers focused on overcoming challenges. The executive wasn't used to hearing these everyday challenges, so to them it seemed like they were bogged down. Executive stakeholders are part of the group that you need to manage closely. They'll use their own executive language that doesn't have the same terms as project management. So communicating with your executives is a dual challenge. You need to make sure that you're monitoring their communications, but you'll also need to make sure that you're using executive-friendly language. When you speak to executives, try to keep 3 things in mind. First, understand the executive's key motivators. Second, be concise. Third, try to understand the big picture. Let's start with the first, understanding the executive's key motivators. The executive for your project could have a whole portfolio of other projects, so they'll mostly be interested in a successful project delivery. That makes their motivators slightly different from that of the project manager. The project manager is primarily focused with delivering the project on time and on budget. So when you talk to your executives, use the language of quality and delivery. If they ask about the project, try to list out the recent accomplishments. Then let the executive know that you're on schedule. If you're behind schedule, be sure to use formal written communication. The second thing is be concise. In project management, you'll often hear the term elevator pitch. This is the 30-second summary of your project status. It might be the same type of update that you'd give to a friend or a family member. Executives are not used to hearing challenges unless there's a recommended fix. So be concise. Never give your executive a list of unsolved challenges. It will just seem like you're not handling the project. The final thing to keep in mind is try to have a big picture of where your project fits into the executive's overall portfolio. Your executive sponsor will have challenges beyond just your project. They'll appreciate when you consider how your project fits into the overall organization. When you start your project, it's easy to become focused on what you'll need to accomplish. You don't often get a chance to step back and think about how the project gets started. You'll just need a simple statement that shows that you see beyond the walls of your project. This shows that you can see the forest and not just your tree. Executives often appreciate that greater depth of communication. As a project manager, it's inevitable. At some point, a stakeholder is going to ask you a tough question. Your instincts might be to sugarcoat the answer. You might even try to ignore the question. You should fight these instincts. I once worked on a project for a group of schools. The project was behind schedule, and one of the stakeholders sat me down and asked, "Why do you think we should fund this project if this software isn't working?" If this happens to you, try to remember the acronym NEACE. N, never get upset. I, illustrate their question with examples. E, empathize with the stakeholder. C, clarify the question. And E, explain your answer. I'd been working on this project for over a year, so it was difficult to not get defensive. But I didn't get upset. Instead, I asked him to illustrate with some examples. He said he had given a demonstration to a group of customers and the software didn't create student accounts. Using active listening, I tried to get him to clarify the question. So which part of the software wasn't working? Was it just the create student accounts? Try to get very specific illustrations. You'll want to focus on the question and not on the stakeholder. You'd never want to ask something like, "Why do you think the software is not working?" That type of question might make the stakeholder defensive. You just want to make sure that you understand the question. All of your listening should have empathy. Admit to wrongdoing or mistakes. Understand the stakeholder's point of view. Then you'll want to clarify the original question. Are you asking me if we should cancel the project? When you clarify the question, you have a much better sense of what the stakeholder's actually thinking. Remember, his question actually has a positive tilt to it. He's asking why he shouldn't cancel the project. Compare that to, "Please shut down the project." That type of clarification probably means that your project's already canceled. The final and perhaps most important part of the NEACE acronym is to explain your answer. When the stakeholder is asking you a question, it's usually because they're going to use your answer with somebody else. So a lot of times when the stakeholder asks you a question, what they're really asking is, "Give me an answer I can use." So be sure to give them your full thought process. Something like, "I don't think we should cancel this project because we decided to develop the software very quickly. We did this because we knew that the customer would make a lot of changes. The downside to delivering it quickly is that we'll spend more time debugging." So after you explain your answer, you might want to make some suggestions on how to improve the process. The stakeholder for the schools decided not to cancel the project. He even used my illustrations to explain to the other schools the issue at the next demonstration. Focusing on the question really improved our communication. If you work for a large organization, then you might run into the challenge of communicating in a cross-functional team. A cross-functional team is a group of employees from different functional areas working together to deliver a common product. Most organizations are still divided up into different functional areas. Some common functional areas are sales, finance, marketing, human resources, and technology. That means that you might have someone from sales, finance, and software development all working together on the same team. For more on how cross-functional teams work, check out Working on a Cross-Functional Team in our library. The big challenge with cross-functional teams is that people underestimate the shared language and concepts that are part of each functional area. So it's probably second nature for salespeople to talk about quarterly sales goals and conversion rates. But this might not be familiar to software developers. The key way to overcome this challenge is to make sure that you're doing a lot of cross-training between the team members in different functional areas. A software developer might not be interested in understanding conversion rates, but in a cross-functional team, they have to learn all these different terms. That's because this shared language is a core part of what makes these teams effective. It might seem tedious for software developers to learn about sales and for salespeople to learn about software, but that's the price you'll pay for this efficient level of shared communication. I once worked for an organization that had a cross-functional team that was working on a common finance product. The finance people explained to the developers the differences between cash flow, assets, and liabilities. Then the software developers communicated the differences between JavaScript, mobile apps, and test-driven development. The team was able to make decisions much more quickly once they had this shared language. It leveled the playing field and made everybody feel like they could contribute to group discussions. They weren't spending time clarifying jargon and could quickly reach consensus. When you're working on a cross-functional team, you want to make sure that you're comfortable both teaching and learning. You'll need to make sure that you're not afraid to ask questions. Let your team members know when you don't understand a term or concept. It's equally important that you're patient when communicating with other team members. You may have been working for decades in the same functional area, so it may have been some time since you've had to explain key concepts that are commonly used in your functional area. It takes patience to explain this to someone who might be entirely unfamiliar with the concept. You might learn something yourself when trying to explain a concept simply. If your functional area has a lot of different language and concepts, then you might want to create a shared jargon board. This is just a whiteboard in your team space that lists out some of the shared language that your team needs for better communication. This could be acronyms that you use in your functional area or even industry-specific terms. Some teams may find that they even need small training sessions where one team member communicates some key concepts to the rest of the team. These meetings can go a long way toward creating a shared language for easier communication. Many meetings are no longer called meetings. They're called briefings, innovation circles, or executive overviews. But most of these are just a standard conference meeting. And a standard conference meeting is just one of three types of meetings: the conference meeting, work group meetings, and brainstorming meetings. The conference meetings are typical office meetings. It's usually one person presenting slides on a single topic. This meeting will have 5 or more people with one presenter. Conference meetings are the default in most organizations. If you're in a meeting with more than 5 people, then chances are you're in a conference meeting. They're designed to get everyone on the same page or to let everyone know what's going on. Most conference meetings are an efficiency drain on organizations. Studies find that these meetings don't do a good job communicating, but even as efficiency experts squeeze more and more out of organizations, the conference meeting lives on. It hasn't changed much in decades. Most businesses have conference meetings because they're tribal. They're a good opportunity to interact with coworkers. These meetings are a good way to build your networks. So a supervisor will point out an employee's hard work, and that's an important business practice. Conference meetings also cement your place in the organization. They'll give you a sense of where you fit in with everyone else. Finally, conference meetings are often the only way to meet people you wouldn't otherwise meet. Think about some of the people in your organization that you only see in meetings. You'll have to work at it if you want a meeting that's not a conference meeting. If you don't have a set agenda, then your meeting will always default to a conference meeting. If you want to have a more efficient meeting, then you should have a work group meeting. A work group meeting should have a maximum of 5 people. This seems to be the magic number to collaborate. The work group meeting is designed to solve a specific problem. A typical work group meeting has 3 to 5 people. The agenda might be something like figuring out why the server keeps crashing. It also might be a discussion about why an employee is underperforming. The final type of meeting is the brainstorming meeting. A brainstorming meeting is the most difficult to organize of all these 3 types. This is a meeting with a maximum of 7 people. That's enough to get a diversity of viewpoints, but not so much that the meeting splits into separate groups. In a brainstorming meeting, everyone tries to come up with new ideas. Keep in mind that these are very difficult meetings to run. They usually do best with one facilitator who presents questions and everyone tries to come up with creative answers. People should play off of each other's ideas. It's almost like meeting jazz. That's why true brainstorming meetings are very rare. If you're a meeting organizer, be sure to understand the differences between these meetings and which one you'd like to schedule. Also, be sure to name your meeting in a way that best communicates your agenda. It might sound strange, but it's true that many times people are in meetings and they don't know why they're there. Your job as a meeting organizer is to create a clear purpose for your meeting. Everyone should know why they're there. You should organize your meetings with a sleek efficiency using the Sharks approach. The Sharks approach is S. State the agenda before you start your meeting. H. Hijackers will be at your meeting, so watch out. A. Adding relevant information is the key to a good meeting. R. Repeat the agenda at the end of the meeting. K. Keep the meeting small and short. S. Scheduling should be outside of the meeting. So let's start with S. State the agenda at the beginning of the meeting. The agenda should be very clear, something like, this is an hour-long meeting to discuss the challenges with installing the database server. Don't state the agenda at the beginning of the meeting. The agenda should be very small and short. S. Scheduling should be outside of the meeting. So let's start with S. State the agenda at the beginning of the meeting. The agenda should be very clear, something like, this is an hour-long meeting to discuss the challenges with installing the database server. Don't assume that everyone at the meeting will know why they're there. In fact, it's safer to assume that most people at the meeting don't know why they're there. If someone asks a question that's outside of the agenda, just tell them that you'd be happy to answer their question offline. That's where you're in danger of being hijacked. The H in our Sharks approach is that hijackers will be at your meeting. Some people can't help themselves. They'll want to ask questions that are not part of the agenda. If they hear questions about buying servers, they'll chime in and say, we should really streamline our equipment purchasing. Then they'll start a new meeting within your meeting. The only way to keep your meeting from being hijacked is to say that their ideas are outside of the agenda. If you let your meeting get hijacked, then you'll have a reputation as someone who doesn't have productive meetings. The A in the Sharks approach is for adding relevant information. No one should talk at a meeting unless they're adding information. This is particularly challenging for project managers. There's something deep in project managers that forces us to communicate agreement. A project manager will interrupt and say, "Yeah, I agree with that." This can be a distraction that doesn't add information. The R in the Sharks approach is to repeat the agenda at the end of the meeting, then compare the agenda to what actually happened. The K in Sharks is to keep your meeting small and short. Sometimes people go to meetings to find out about the agenda. After they arrive, they realize that there's no reason to be there, so they open up their computer and answer email. You should always be going through the process of invitation grooming. Make sure that only the people that need to be there are there. The last S in the Sharks approach is scheduling. Scheduling should take place outside of the meeting. There's no reason to keep people at the meeting just to schedule the next meeting. Email is a much better tool for scheduling. No reason to keep people at the meeting just to schedule the next meeting. Email is a much better tool for scheduling. Listening to everyone else's schedule is not a good way to communicate that you value their time. If you use the Sharks approach, you'll get a solid reputation as someone who knows how to run productive meetings. People will show up ready to communicate, and you'll get a lot more accomplished. The Romans saw purple as a sign of wealth. So the poet Horace criticized long-winded writers by saying their snazzy wording was like purple patches sewed into their clothing. That's why this extra language is called purple prose. It sounds fancy, but it's really just a patchwork of bad ideas. 2,000 years later, you'll still see a lot of purple prose. Many reports use these purple patches to hide bad ideas. Some project managers believe that if an idea is wordy, it might seem more thoughtful and acceptable to stakeholders. But most reports shouldn't hide bad ideas. Instead, you should try to focus on brevity and clarity. A good report communicates just what the reader needs to know. Here's an actual paragraph from a report that I received on a project. Because of missed opportunities to properly utilize the business requirements documents, the business analyst team recommends a partial scale back of the development team so the timeline is flattened into the next quarter for budgeting and possible schedule realignment. Now imagine if this was reworded more concisely. To cut costs, we recommend that the team extend software development into the next quarter. This report is saying that the developers should slow down so that they can save more money, which for a project manager is a bad idea. Projects that take longer almost always go over budget. So here are some ways that you can keep your reports free of purple prose. First, always make sure that you're using the minimum language you'll need to communicate. Watch out for those I's words. We wish to utilize. We want to make sure that we prioritize, or this is how we finalize. When you add the I's, it makes the sentence more complicated. Compare this. If we prioritize this, it would lead to a better outcome, as opposed to this. This is a high priority. The I's words only make the sentence more confusing. Also, try to avoid the passive voice in your reports. The passive voice makes the object of the sentence the subject of the sentence. So here's a passive voice. The report was created by the project manager. Here's an active voice. The project manager created the report. The passive voice sounds like the idea doesn't have ownership. It's used in reports to hedge an idea. Finally, don't be afraid to use bullet points. Remember, your report should have the minimum amount of language you'll need to communicate. Bullet points are great for just that purpose. You'll find the busiest stakeholders depend on bullet points. Many projects are funded not by the report's language, but by its shorter bullet points. Some people effortlessly put words on a page. They'll sit in front of a computer and write out clear sentences. But these people are rare. They should be celebrated and not copied. Many of us either write badly or spend a lot of time rewriting. Overly complex writing doesn't make your ideas sound more impressive. In fact, making complex ideas seem simple is much more difficult. If you can do that in your reports, then you'll have a much easier time communicating ideas. Each time you sit down, you can spit, polish, and shine your way to clear writing. First, spit out everything you can think of. Just start writing everything that comes to mind into an open document. Don't worry about grammar or even punctuation. Just get it all out. This will give you some place to start. Then walk away from your document. Just leave it alone. Either do something else or start another report. Wait as long as it takes to forget about what you wrote. Then later, go back and polish your writing. Read your document from beginning to end. Move paragraphs so that there's a clear flow. The polish part is pretty difficult. Unless you're very talented, the report you spat out will look like a cluttered mess. You'll probably spend a lot of time over-explaining the least interesting ideas in your report. Try to carefully think about your audience. Who's your reader? What will they know? Why is the reader interested in your document? The polished part of your writing should be the part that takes the longest, so take the time to look objectively at what you wrote. At this point, you should walk away again from your report. You should take the biggest break to clear up your head. You'll need a fresh perspective for your final edit. In this last stage, you'll shine up what you wrote. Do a final review to tighten up your writing. Many writers use too much text, so look for sentences that are restatements. You might see some of these in the words themselves. Look for phrases like "in other words" or "in summary." These will often be unnecessary restatements. It's fine to use restatements while talking, but when you're writing, you can go back and change what you're saying, so there's no reason for restatements. You don't want to say that your first sentence was unclear, so here's another one. The final pass to shine things up should remove all of that extra material. If you spit, polish, and shine, you'll have a much better chance of writing clearly without spending too much time staring at an open document. Remember that the first step to being a clear writer is to get those first words on the page. Simple sketches are a powerful tool for complex ideas. You'll want your reports to communicate well to everyone. Some of your stakeholders will be visual thinkers, so they'll have a much easier time reading your report if you include some simple sketches. A sketch can be a chart, graph, or even a small figure. A smiley face is a good way to show a happy outcome. A bar chart shows comparisons. A light bulb is an easy way to show an idea. These are all simple sketches that communicate ideas quickly and effectively. A sketch can take advantage of the context. The reader can intuitively see how each idea fits into your report, even with something simple like a smiley face over a dollar bill. So your sketch doesn't need extra information. You don't have to write out increased profits or how happy are you with your stay. This keeps your reports brief. In this report, the smiley face communicates a happy outcome. The dollar bill communicates profits. This small sketch takes advantage of your reader's understanding that increased profits leads to a positive outcome. Anyone who's used instant messaging knows how much you can communicate with a little emoji, even though what you're saying has a different context. A sketch is also the best way to show relative differences. It's much easier to see how concepts relate to each other. A pie chart shows the parts of a whole. A bar chart can show relative sizing. These sketches are usually easier to understand than percentages and ratios. A sketch can also be the best way to show complex relationships. Imagine you're creating a report for a database migration. Here you can show just an image of the data server with 5 arrows pointing to new servers. A clear sketch will also invite discussion. If you're a project manager, you already probably realize the power of whiteboards. A few simple sketches on the whiteboard are a quick way to start a discussion. You can take this same concept and apply it to all of your reports. People will often ask to explain a confusing sketch over confusing text. If someone reads confusing text, they'll assume they misread it. But if someone sees a confusing diagram, they're more likely to ask for an explanation. Finally, an interesting sketch can hold your reader's attention. A few well-placed sketches will give your readers something interesting to think about. You can test this yourself by including some colorful charts in your report. Then hand a copy to your team member, and you'll notice that they'll flip through all the pages of text and stop for a second when they see the diagram. Those few extra seconds are giving you just a little bit more of their attention. Communication management is a broad topic. If you're studying for your project management professional exam, your next steps can be to learn the language used by the Project Management Institute. Most of the PMI communication management knowledge area was covered in this course. So even though there are some different terms, you should have a sense of the overall concepts. If you're interested in sitting for the exam, be sure to check out the course Cert Prep, Project Management Professional PMP by Sandra Mitchell. As a project manager, you spend most of your time communicating, so you should try to continue to improve your skills. You should never feel that you know enough about communication. There's so many ways to improve. Great communication can be one of the most rewarding aspects of project management. Few things will serve your career better than communication skills.